Across this now vine-covered valley on an October morning in 1854, bugles blared. Moments later, 666 cavalrymen surged forward, unaware they were riding straight into disaster. A fatal miscommunication had set them on a doomed charge into Russian guns, down a place now known as the Valley of Death. This is the story of the charge of the Light Brigade. The genesis of that fateful day came 8 months earlier when Britain had issued an ultimatum to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, whose troops had crossed the Danube into Turkey in a prospective land grab masquerading as a minor religious dispute. Britain was concerned that if Russian forces took the Turkish capital of Constantinople, the Tsar's Black Sea fleet would gain access to the Mediterranean, threatening vital trade routes to India. When the Tsar ignored the British ultimatum, London declared war. On the 28th of March 1854, the conflict to be remembered as the Crimean War began. Immediately, Britain joined forces with France and Turkey and gathered a fleet to carry a combined expeditionary army of 64,000 men. Throughout the summer they arrived, eventually moving into encampments on the Black Sea coast, near to where the Turks were facing down the Russian army in Silistria. When, though, the Russians withdrew their forces, it looked to the British and French that their aims had been achieved without needing to fire a shot. This didn't sit right with their political masters, though. While the Russian Black Sea fleet was still intact and able to operate from the Crimean port of Sevastopol, the Allies felt a Russian sword remained poised at Turkey's jugular. So, in September, the Allied army crossed the Black Sea and landed on the Crimean peninsula. The plan? Seize Sevastopol and destroy the Black Sea fleet. The British contingent was led by 65-year-old Lord Raglan, a seasoned staff officer who had lost his arm serving the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo, but who had worryingly little command experience in the field. Amongst his forces were the men of the British Light Brigade, hailing from 5 cavalry regiments, the 4th and 13th Light Dragoons, the 8th and 11th Hussars, and the 17th Lancers. Their role was reconnaissance, flank protection, and exploitation of any opportunities on the battlefield. Each regiment was formed of 2 squadrons, which each had 2 troops of roughly 75 men and horses each. The bulk of those riding with the Lights in Crimea were in their mid to late 20s, working class lads, farm labourers, farriers, grooms or ostlers who would have had daily contact with horses before joining up. In the era of purchase system, the officers were an entirely different proposition. Buying a commission and promotions in a smart cavalry regiment was extremely expensive, and as a result, wealthy officers would promote over the heads of their more competent, experienced but poorer peers. This was most infamously evidenced in the characters at the head of the Light Brigade. The cavalry division was commanded by Lieutenant General George Bingham, 3rd Earl of Lucan, and the Lights were under the command of Major General James Brudenell, 7th Earl of Cardigan. Both earls, who were brothers-in-law, famously hated each other. Their mutual animosity was so entrenched that when the Duke of Wellington attempted to mediate, he got nowhere and gave up, declaring that his victory at Waterloo was far easier won than any reconciliation between these feuding earls. It was unsurprising, therefore, that the cavalry's campaign started badly. From their arrival in the east, Lord Raglan attempted to micromanage the commands of both Lucan and Cardigan, the result being that on the march towards Sevastopol they were held in check, recalled whenever they advanced on the enemy, they got themselves lost and were laughed at by both the enemy and their own infantry, who gave them the morale-sapping sobriquet, the look-ons, due to Lord Lucan's unwillingness to commit them at the crucial moment. After 12 days of misuse, the Lights arrived here at Balaclava, a small fishing village on the south of the Crimean Peninsula, where the Royal Navy could land reinforcements and supplies needed for the siege to begin on the now encircled Sevastopol. As the heavy cavalry brigade came ashore at Balaclava, the Lights joined them in picket and patrol duties around the hills, plains and valleys surrounding the beachhead. By this time, the Russian army, under Prince Menshikov, had been beaten back from the Alma Heights and were regrouping to the east of the Chernaya River. By late October, there was growing anxiety that a Russian advance from the east might lift the Allied siege, which was making slow progress on reducing Sevastopol. Looking at the ground, we can see that Raglan and his staff were faced with a tricky problem. While Balaclava was a fine port for resupply, it was 7 miles away from Sevastopol, and most of the Allied army was dug in at the siege encampment. This left this 7-mile supply line between the port and city to be secured by cavalry patrols and a thin line of redoubts along this position, the Causeway Heights. The Causeway Heights, the main route from the east towards Sevastopol, was occupied by over 1,000 Turkish soldiers who built 4 earth-banked redoubts to house their 12-pounder guns. From their positions here, they could look south towards Balaclava Port over a wide valley named South Valley, and to their north over the narrower North Valley, today a wine-growing area, but then open plains. Towards these, the Fedekine Heights. To their west was the commanding Sapun Ridge, and to their east ran the Chernaya River and the main Russian army. That force of 30,000 infantry, cavalry and artillery, manning 78 guns, were ordered late on the 24th to advance westwards, take the Allied positions on the Causeway Heights, then drive onwards, cut off Sevastopol from the supply port at Balaclava, and threaten the rear of the Allied siege lines around the city. And so, at 5 AM on the 25th, Russian guns opened on the redoubts, followed by infantry and cavalry who stormed the Causeway Heights and after a bitter fight forced the Turkish defenders from their position. By 9 AM the situation was critical, with only 1 infantry battalion and 2 brigades of cavalry standing in the way of disaster. That infantry, stout Highlanders, came from the 93rd Regiment of Foot. Led by Sir Colin Campbell, a 62-year-old Peninsular War veteran, the 550 men were positioned on a rise right in front of Balaclava town, and it was here that they would make their stand. To their front, and approaching at a trot from the now Russian-held Causeway Heights, was a force of enemy cavalry, some 500 strong. Arranging his red-coated men into a line only 2 ranks deep, with guns positioned on either flank, Sir Colin rode out in front of his men shouting, "Men, remember, there is no retreat from here. You must die where you stand." Away to the northwest on the Sapun Ridge, the journalist William Russell watched on as this line of red-jacketed Scotsmen slammed volley after volley into the advancing cavalry, ultimately holding them and then turning them back in disarray. As the Highlanders cheered with relief and tossed their bonnets in the air, Russell scribbled in his notebook the words "Thin Red Line," an epitaph that still stands for British stoicism and calmness under fire. But the cavalry that had attacked the Highlanders was just one small fork of a much larger force. The remainder had topped the Causeway Heights and now found 4 regiments of the British Heavy Brigade under General Sir James Scarlett trotting across their path on their way to support the Redcoats. Recognising the threat, Scarlett gave the order and the Heavies charged headlong uphill into a mass of Russian cavalry almost 3 times their number, and incredibly, won, driving the enemy horsemen away at the gallop. All this time, just 500 yards away, the Light Brigade watched on. When the Russians withdrew in disorder, Captain William Morris of the 17th Lancers rode over to Lord Cardigan and asked, "My lord, are we not going to charge the flying enemy?" Cardigan replied, "No, we have orders to remain here." This inactivity allowed the Russian cavalry to reform at this position at the far end of the North Valley, with 8 Cossack artillery pieces drawn up across their front and more guns and infantry on the heights to either side of the valley, a formidable defensive position. Let's understand the situation a little better. So, the redoubts along the Causeway Heights, splitting the north and south valleys, are now in Russian hands. Balaclava, thanks in large part to the Thin Red Line, remains under British control. The main Russian cavalry force is here, behind a battery of 8 guns in line along the North Valley. By 9:45 AM, Raglan had called forward an infantry division from Sevastopol to secure his supply lines, but it was yet to arrive and he was now getting impatient to take the offensive. This left him with only cavalry at his disposal. He sent an order to Lucan. Cavalry to advance and take advantage of any opportunity to recover the heights. Advance on 2 fronts. On receiving this, Lord Lucan understood that he was to advance as soon as the approaching infantry arrived. To prepare, he placed the Heavy Brigade at the entrance to the South Valley and the Light Brigade at the entrance of the North Valley. With his 2 fronts ready, he waited. But by 10:30 AM, Lord Raglan was becoming irate with his stationary British cavalry below. Then, from his vantage point on the Sapun Ridge, he saw movement at one of the redoubts and believed the Russians were about to drag some of the captured Allied guns away. Determined to prevent it, he dictated his most fateful order at 10:45. It still exists. Lord Raglan wishes the cavalry to advance rapidly to the front, follow the enemy and try to prevent the enemy carrying away the guns. When the duty staff officer rode forward to take the message, Raglan said, "No, send Nolan." Captain Nolan was one of the army's most accomplished riders and perhaps the ablest to descend a precipitous 650 feet to the plain below. As Nolan moved off, Raglan shouted after him, "Tell Lord Lucan the cavalry is to attack immediately." When Nolan, who disliked Lucan, reached him here on the valley floor, the scene was set for an infamous exchange. Lucan, who couldn't see any guns from his position, but had seen some down here a short time earlier when crossing from the south to the north valley, questioned the order saying, "Attack, sir? Attack what? What guns, sir? Where and what to do?" With visible contempt, Nolan replied, "There, my lord, there is your enemy, there are your guns," seemingly pointing straight down the mouth of the North Valley and not at the Causeway Heights. This is the key exchange in what followed. With no obvious target in sight, Lucan seems to have assumed that Nolan was referring to the guns that he had seen at the north end of the valley earlier, and not, as Nolan meant, but did not specify, charging the hidden guns on the Causeway Heights right here. As Lord Tennyson would famously write, someone had blundered. At this, Lucan rode to Cardigan and told him to attack the Russians in the valley. When Cardigan pointed out the peril of batteries to front and flank, Cardigan replied, "I cannot help that. It is Lord Raglan's positive order that the Light Brigade is to attack the enemy." And so, with orders and formation of advance given, Cardigan gave his first order. "Draw swords!" Over 500 sabres flashed out of scabbards into the carry while lancers re-gripped their ash shafts. Then he gave his second order. "The brigade will advance, 1st Squadron of the 17th Lancers direct," meaning that the Lancer Squadron behind Cardigan would act as the direction guide. With the order, "Walk march," given, Lucan and then Cardigan's trumpeters both sounded the advance, and the Light Brigade moved forward. Then came the call for the trot, and the pace increased, harness chains and scabbards all jangling together over the drum of hooves. At regulation pace, 6 inches knee to knee, the brigade would take about 7 minutes to close with the enemy 1.25 miles away. And contrary to popular cinematic depiction, only truly charging over the final 50 yards. At 11:11 AM, a battery of Russian guns on the Fedekine Heights thundered out. Captain Nolan was at that very moment riding across the face of the advance, according to some wildly gesticulating towards Cardigan. Had Nolan seen the error? Did he realise Cardigan was about to charge the wrong guns? Whatever his message, it remained unsaid, as moments later a piece of shrapnel sliced his chest open and he dropped dead from his saddle, the first to fall, leaving the remainder of the 600 advancing into the jaws of death. As the brigade pushed on at the trot and the enemy cannon fire increased from right and left, more men began to fall. Private Albert Mitchell described the advance. Oaths might be heard between the reports of the guns and the bursting shells as the men crowded and jostled each other to close up. This was unavoidable at times, especially when a shell burst in the ranks, sometimes bringing down 3 or 4 men and horses. The lights continued ever forward, deeper into the North Valley. As they came under more fire on both sides, their ranks endured the effects of shot and shell. Officers witnessed troopers to either side lose limbs to round shot. Men were splattered by the gore of their friends and had horses killed and wounded beneath them. Meanwhile, behind the Light Brigade, Lord Lucan and the Heavies had also started forward into the North Valley in support, facing their second fight in less than 3 hours. To the left, the Chasseurs d'Afrique were also busy charging the flank of a battery on the Fedekine Heights, forcing a gun team to hitch and withdraw. As the Heavies moved up into trot, Colonel John York, commanding the Royal Dragoons, described seeing injured members of the Lights limping rearwards. It was a fearful sight, and the appearance of all who retired was as if they had passed through a heavy shower of blood, positively dripping and saturated, and arms blowing back like empty sleeves as the poor fellows ran to the rear. A moment later, and York too had been unhorsed and his legs shattered by a shell. The Heavy Brigade would have suffered more had Lucan not suddenly had a change of heart, turning the brigade back. For the Heavies to desert their comrades in the Light Brigade was unthinkable, but Lucan remarked, "They've sacrificed the Light Brigade, they shall not have the Heavy if I can help it." Ahead of them the situation was becoming desperate as more men fell, now to the rifle bullets of Russian marksmen who opened on them from both flanks. On they went. When the first line was about 250 yards from the guns at the end of the valley, Lord Cardigan shouted an order to his trumpeter, who, wetting his lips, sounded the gallop. Spurs were pressed home and finally, those still alive and in the saddle surged towards the guns. At about 100 yards range, the Russian gunners loaded with canister instead of round shot, now spat hundreds of lead balls out in a cone of deadly spray that could barely miss the approaching line. Each discharge left heaps of broken and mangled horses and men. But those who survived bore down on the guns with a burning desire for revenge. Seconds later, Cardigan called for the charge, and the iconic note sound in the full fury of the lights was unleashed. Lances and sabres were brought down to the engage, and as Lieutenant Gordon of the 17th Lancers recalled, "We, like bulldogs who had been tied up all day, were too glad to be let loose, and off we went at a thundering gallop." This gallop took the first line straight into a thick bank of smoke now lying heavy about the guns. Within seconds the survivors came charging in, slashing down at Russian gunners, thrusting lance points through torsos and wreaking a mad vengeance for the men and horses lying scattered over the hellish mile they'd just crossed. Of the first line, the 17th Lancers and the 13th Light Dragoons, less than half reached the guns. Most joined in the melee at the gun line, while others continued on through 80 yards of smoke to encounter a large mass of waiting Russian cavalry. This included Lord Cardigan, who on seeing the overwhelming mass of enemy seems to have wheeled about and beat a swift solo retreat back across the valley. Command fell to Lieutenant Colonel Mayo, who also met the Russian cavalry but decided attack was the only option. Rallying a group of 27 men, he gallantly led a charge at the far greater group of opponents, scattering them 500 yards back to the Chernaya River. The same happened when Captain Morris of the 17th Lancers led 20 men in a dash against a complete regiment of Russian hussars. They too fled, but once it became clear how few men Morris had, they encircled the Lancers and captured or cut them down. The 11th Hussars, who'd been coming up behind the first line, now thundered through the smoke and found their route blocked by the same Russian Hussars. Like those before him, their commander, Colonel Douglas, also went straight at them, with the 80 men surviving from the 11th, sending them fleeing back over the Chernaya River. The second line of the 4th Light Dragoons and 8th Hussars now joined the fray, but the Hussars had pushed too far right, had missed the guns and had to regroup. The 4th fared better, with one captain unhorsing up to 6 Cossacks, while another vainly attempted to capture a gun. It was in this desperate fighting that several men selflessly went to the aid of their wounded comrades with utter disregard for their own safety. The medal they won was a novel new one, the Victoria Cross. Despite the shock successes by aggressive action amid and behind the guns, it soon became clear that the tide was turning. Isolated and simply too few to hold the position, the remnants of the Light Brigade now turned for home, running the gauntlet once more. But by now the Russians, alive to the chance of trapping an entire British cavalry brigade, had pushed Ulan Lancers round to cut off the retreat up the valley. A Russian officer, Lieutenant Kozhukov, described what happened next. There was only one way out of the valley for the English. They had no choice now but to surrender. We watched for them to lay down their sabres and lances, but that's not what happened. The English chose to do what we had not considered because no one imagined it possible. They chose to charge our cavalry once again, this time heading back along the same ground. These mad cavalrymen were intent on doing what no one thought could be done. This was the scene across the valley as small, tired, bloodied groups of the Light Brigade literally fought their way to safety through Russian cavalry and the unrelenting guns on both flanks. It was an awful sight as unhorsed men limped, walked, ran from cover to cover in ones and twos back along the same fields now strewn with the bodies of their dead and dying friends. By midday, those that could had finally returned to the far end of the North Valley to the cheers of their comrades in the Heavy Brigade. But the toll had been enormous. Of the 666 men who began the advance, 271 became casualties, with 110 killed or dying of their wounds. Their mounts fared no better, with 332 falling during the charge and a further 43 later shot for wounds. The Light Brigade was effectively broken, and what was left would be destroyed by the Russian winter to come. After reading William Russell's account of the battle in the Times just 20 days later, the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson put pen to paper with his poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, the final words of which sum up the courage and tragedy of that fateful charge. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell, that they who had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the Light Brigade, noble 600. Powerful and poignant though Tennyson's words are, perhaps a more accurate observation was given by the French general Pierre Bosquet as he watched on from the Sapoon Heights. C'est magnifique, mais ce n'est pas la guerre, c'est de la folie. It's magnificent, but it isn't war, it's madness. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider joining our Patreon or YouTube membership communities. Your support is essential in helping us to create content just like this, with each documentary taking hundreds of hours to create. By joining our supporter community, you also get access to loads of exclusive content, including full-length virtual battlefield tours covering some of the most famous episodes from throughout military history. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.